And yeah, lots of coming at it from lots of different perspectives. Um, so yeah, I think I will start with my presentation, and then we'll should have plenty of time for Q&A later. So hopefully, it's just sharing my. Are you seeing that?
Uh, nearly need full view would be good.
Oh yeah, there we
Yeah,
go. Of
yeah.
course. Um, is that good now?
No, we see your presenter mode at the
Okay,
moment.
sorry. We sorted this out earlier, didn't we?
We
Um,
did.
Slideshow and then play from the start.
Slideshow is at the bottom.
Or in the top one, play from the start.
Oh, that's nice.
A black hole of economics, that is.
there we go.
Wow, how do you do that?
That looked like Rachel Reeves' economic strategy, I think, to me.
I was about to say that actually.
Yes, right.
We must send it to Rachel Reeves actually. Gives her some idea.
On the top, if you go to slideshow and then do play from the start.
Slide share and then play from the start.
The
The words.
along the top menu next to animations.
Not seeing where you're talking about.
Animations, slideshow, record, review. It's under the orange bar where it says slideshow.
Yeah.
Up, yeah. You click on slideshow and then play from the start. To the right, up, left,
Yeah.
up.
It's the
I
word.
can't see it because it's. Hold on.
Keep going.
Slideshow.
Left.
Sorry, it was. Play from
Now,
the start.
top left.
I'm so sorry about this.
It's all right.
Bingo.
Can you see it, or can you see my screen?
We can see your screen.
This is what I was trying to avoid.
That's interesting, isn't it? What can you do?
Yeah, doesn't
Hey,
do that
you
with
may
me.
have shared your screen rather than I do this sometimes, rather than the
Rather than the document.
document.
Or else open this slideshow full and then do screen
we-
share.
That one at the bottom. Yeah, you could do that one as well.
That's now better or not?
No, it goes worse.
Back.
It's not the end of the world. I mean,
Yeah.
if we can live with this, I think.
You
Yeah.
can still see it. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
sorry.
it's
I think
fine.
we're gonna have to. We're gonna
Yeah,
have to do
go with
that.
that. Go with that.
My
We just
my
make it bigger
apologies.
on our end, just expand the screen.
Okay, yeah, apologies, technical malfunction. Right, so yeah, as I said, real pleasure to speak with you. Sorry about that little snafu. So this is the book I'm going to talk about, which I've been working on for the past few years and was published by Bristol University Press in November, and seems to have hit a chord with some people, has been picking up some decent reviews. I wanted to tell you a little bit about my background. So I am not an academic. My background is, well, I studied history for an undergrad and then international politics for a master's, where I got to study international political economy, which is sort of a breakaway academic field, which started in the 70s, essentially, where a number of people decided that neither economics nor politics could understand what was happening at the global level, because each more or less ignored the other. And so they tried to put these two together with international political economy. And I've done quite a lot of sort of research and writing on one of the founders of that, a lady called Susan Strange, who I think has profoundly interesting and prescient thoughts. But my background, for over a decade, I worked for various NGOs, which hopefully you can see here. So producing various different reports. I worked for a while on Central Africa, so doing stuff around British listed oil companies trying to exploit oil in, Africa's oldest national park, or some major mining and oil deals where a lot of the money was, siphoned offshore to the British Virgin Islands and others rather than staying in Congo, one of the poorest countries in the world. And I used to work on something called RED as well, which is reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. And so these are some of the reports. What I have written on is different, though. This is an image of David Ricardo, who is an economist, stockbroker and economist, who mainly was active in the early 19th century, around the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and actually played a role in the Napoleonic Wars, in that he was sort of helping to finance British government debts during that time, and became quite a wealthy man. And yeah, as Ian said, he's possibly not he's certainly not the most famous name in economics. Most people, if you ask them who the founder of economics would be, they would say, certainly Western economics, they'd say Adam Smith. And I argue in the book that Ricardo was the other founder of economics. And actually, the way that Adam Smith did economics is vastly, vastly different to how the modern sort of rationalist mainstream economist will do economics. And it's also different to how Ricardo did it. But I argue that Ricardo introduced many things, including very simplified models, and also a famous theory of international trade called comparative advantage. And then I essentially, what I do in the book, in the first third of the book, it contrasts the Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which was massively influential in the 90s and the 2000s, and in some quarters still is, sort of arguing for the way that as long as we drop all tariffs and we have free trade, then globalization will lift all boats. And I contrast that with a historical story of the real trade between England and Portugal, which is kind of the classic example given of the benefits of free trade. And I point to the massive gap between theory and historical reality, and then I go through various other areas in the final third of the book. So trade, finance, anti-monopoly or antitrust policy, a little bit on tax, and the environment, where this method, and sorry, this gap between theory and reality has, as I say, led us into a dangerous place, led us astray. The argument of my book, if I was going to sum it up in one image, is this image here. Does anyone, I'm going to say not Guy, because I know you've read the book, but can anyone tell me who the who the artist is and who they are depicting in this? Just jump in.
William Blake, it's supposed to be Newton, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a very strange Newton, because he's sort of like a Greek god, kind of, very muscular Newton that I don't think the real Isaac Newton was like that at all. But no, it is a William Blake image from around 1805. And what is interesting about it is that you see Newton focused very narrowly on this geometric pattern in front of him, and yet sort of unaware of the sort of swirling organic forms around him. And I sort of start and end the book with Newton, because I say that a lot of what economics has tried to do is aspire to the certainty, the precision, the objectivity of physics. And in doing so, what they have done is actually made many important things conceptually disappear, and that has caused great damage. So that's essentially my argument. So yeah, I'm gonna jump in a little bit. I guess I want to say, in relation to all of your introductions earlier, that economics is very hard. Physics, in contrast, although it's hard, at least you're dealing with inanimate objects. And yes, a lot of what I try to discuss in the book is sort of 200 years of grappling over how to do theory and where it's right and where it's wrong. But one of my interests is, as someone said, economics is at the root of so much. And it's also, someone was mentioning anthropology as well. As I understand it, well, I know from my studies of political science, but there's very much, or there has been up until recently, a sort of hierarchy in the social sciences. And economics has seen itself, and also quite often, some people have quite clearly told other people that economics is the queen of the social sciences. They're the most rigorous, the most scientific, the most quantified, and everyone else needs to catch up and be like them. Otherwise, they're just wishy-washy sort of humanities. And so economics has had, and some of its ideas, like the economic human, or the selfish individual, Homo economicus, have had vast influence, not just economics, but in the way that we look at many different areas. And yeah, part of my interest in looking at economics is because I think in all of the work I was doing with NGOs, whether that was on corruption or whether that was on environmental things, the sort of economic arguments were the more sort of structural arguments in the background. And so I'm sort of taking a while to look at some of those structural arguments. So this is the only slide I have in the presentation. It's a sort of classic example of, it's essentially how Ricardo's argument for free trade is often taught to students today, or has been. And so, as I said, Ricardo used this example of England and Portugal exchanging cloth and wine. And the classic story goes that Adam Smith came up with this thing called absolute advantage. And so he said essentially that if you can get wine cheaper from abroad, rather than, spending 30 times as much wine constructing greenhouses in Scotland, and sort of, heating them, and making wine in Scotland, it's far more efficient to do what Scotland is good at and then buy wine from abroad in France. But the common story goes, he didn't really have an argument for, if there's a country who's worse at doing anything, why is it in their interest to trade? And Ricardo came through with his theory called comparative advantage, and essentially provided the argument for why, even if you're worse at doing everything, it's still in your it's still in everyone's interest to trade. And so the classic example he gave was England and Portugal, and they were, in his example, exchanging cloth and wine. And Portugal, in the model, is better at creating both wine and cloth. But he worked out that England is comparatively better at producing cloth and Portugal comparatively better at producing wine. So if each focused on what they were least worst at and then traded, there would still be, each would produce more and global output would be more. And so that's kind of what you're seeing in this box on the right-hand side. Whereas in the second scenario of trade, number 2, you can see there's more corn and there's more wine. Sorry, more cloth and more wine overall. And these have been called Ricardo's, magic numbers. This has been called utterly true, immensely sophisticated, important for world trade, used by people like the World Trade Organization and others to sort of promote the, move to freer trade from the 80s onwards. And what I do in the first part of the book, and I'm inspired here by a political economist called Matthew Watson, who's at Warwick University. And I try to, what I show is actually putting it in a colonial context. This is I'm sorry it's coming up so small on your screens, but essentially what we have here is London here exchanging cloth to Portugal and wine coming back. And so there was a real trade in English cloth and Portuguese wine, which Ricardo wrote about. He partly did because Adam Smith had written about it, but Portugal never exported enough wine to make up for the English cloth. And cloth at the time was the, high-tech good. And for decades and decades, they had a trade imbalance. And the way that they made it up was actually through exporting, sometimes clandestinely, gold to England, to Britain, as it became huge amounts of gold. And this gold came from their Brazilian colony. And the Brazilian, the gold in Brazil was mined by enslaved Africans. And actually, the discovery of gold in about the 1690s and early 1700s led to a huge gold rush. There's a historian of it who said nothing like it had ever happened in history, and nothing like it again would happen until the 1849 gold rush in California. And it actually supercharged the transatlantic slave trade. And it's not actually, I would say, a coincidence that this classic example of England and Portugal actually rests on England and Portugal were the two, basically top the list of the number of the countries who transport the most number of enslaved people across the Atlantic. And so what you actually have to do is put this trade in its larger colonial context. But all of that is ignored by Ricardo. Actually, Adam Smith acknowledged some of it. He said, all of our gold comes from Brazil. He at least taught about, wrote about it in somewhat. Ricardo ignores it, and most sort of mainstream economists since have ignored it. So this is what Matthew Watson has written. He said Ricardo's numbers are a mathematical facade behind which the actual historical relations of production of the real England and Portugal are deliberately taken out of the equation, and those social relations are explicitly oppressive, based on slave labor and the imperial policing of national hierarchies. So, as I say, I use this to contrast. You have one story that is, repeated time and time again. You can read it in the New Yorker, the New York Times. Oh, English cloth and Portuguese wine. There was a piece in the Financial Times just the other day about, it's called Maganomics, about Trump's economics, that that repeated the same story of English cloth and Portuguese wine. But essentially, I argue that it's a fairy tale. It's a very sort of sanitized, romanticized fairy tale of the real of the real trade. So what I'm trying to do is to give a different view of David Ricardo. And I want to put him in, I put him in his time. And he's often seen sometimes as an abolitionist, someone who wanted to abolish slavery based on one speech he gave once. And I put that in greater context and show actually he was quite ambivalent about slavery and quite happy for it to continue. He was actually writing at a time after the slave trade had been abolished, but before slavery itself, the institution of slavery, because that was 1807 slave trade, and then 1833 the abolition of slavery. And so he was writing smack bang in the middle. His great work, which is the Principles of Political Economy in 1817. But yeah, he was sort of quite ambivalent about slavery. And I argue that he was vastly different to Adam Smith. My book attempts to trace, sometimes I say it's the 200-year battle between whether unrealistic assumptions are a good starting point for economic theory or not. And I broadly stretch the birth, the death, and then the rebirth of this idea. So very broadly, you have the birth with David Ricardo, who was a much more abstract, you could say, deductive thinker than Adam Smith. And then that idea, classical economics, as it was known, largely fell out of favor. And more historical and institutional economists in Germany, in the UK, and in the US really came to the fore. and there was more pluralism within economics. There were many different schools, and there was much less dogma, I would argue. And then in America in the 1950s and 60s, there was a return, as I would say, to this abstract economics. One critic at the time, who went on to win a Nobel Prize, said it was like Herbert Simon, who was an early behavioral economist. He said it was like building economics on the principle of unreality. And I think that's a very good line. That's not how it's been sold, though. And people like Milton Friedman and others have sold, this kind of mainstream economics as as I said, as more scientific, more quantified than others. So essentially, the title Ricardo's Dream, I want to say that Ricardo created a theoretical dream world, and sort of lived in it and believed it. There are other curious things about Ricardo. He's actually a great inspiration for Karl Marx. He had a stratified view of society. He believed in landowners and capitalists and workers, and that was taken on by Marx. I argue that Ricardo, sort of in the parlance of the day, he punched up against the landowners, although he himself became a landowner, but he also punched down on the workers. And he thought that workers' wages should stay very low in order for the factory owners and the capitalists to produce profits, because that was the only thing that kept society moving forward. So he was maybe, and then Marx essentially tweaked that argument in a different way. So I also argue, and this is sort of this is new for many people, but actually it's been argued by other people in the history of economics, that Ricardo was responsible for the idea of the economic human, or the so-called rational, which you should actually call calculating individual, which Guy was talking about, this selfish maximizer. And the story that I tell is, essentially Ricardo, I go into his personal history a bit, which is quite interesting in the book. But he worked in the London Stock Exchange from about the age of 14. His dad, his grandfather, his brothers and uncles were all in the stock exchange. And he was a master of the stock exchange. He had amazing, coolness. He could calculate all of these trades, and he was extremely knowledgeable about the transactions. And actually, all of those are the same qualities that are the qualities of economic man or economic human, in that they're always calculating, they're extremely knowledgeable. And so what I argue, and other people have said before, is essentially that Ricardo was so, for 30 years, he lived and breathed the stock exchange, and helped actually create the first building that was called the London Stock Exchange, because it was started in coffee houses and then moved out. And he essentially looked out onto the world and imagined the world as a giant stock market, and saw the inner stockbroker in everyone. It was a huge leap of imagination. The reason why I really want to sort of put the point on imagination is that often this is seen as more rigorous, more logical. And actually, I want to say, no, this was unrealistic, and a huge leap of imagination. One other analogy that I use to describe some of the ways in which economists have led themselves astray and led others astray is the Greek myth of Pygmalion, which you might know about. It was an inspiration for My Fair Lady, and more recent films such as Her, which is sort of an AI fantasy talking about AI. Essentially, Pygmalion was a Greek ancient Cypriot sculptor who decided he didn't like any regular women, and he was a very brilliant sculptor, and he sculpted this statue of his version of an ideal woman, and eventually basically fell in love with her and bought her jewelry and clothes and laid her in bed with him and things like that. And essentially, there's a famous quote by someone called George Box, and he argues all models are wrong, but some are useful. But Box also said you must not be like Pygmalion and fall in love with your model. And I would argue that too many economists, and actually in other fields too, have fallen in love with their model and not been aware, or actually sort of not directly challenged the problems of the model. The Pygmalion story in the myth ends well, it's for modelers, because he goes to Aphrodite and prays for a girl like his statue, and he comes back and kisses her, and instead of being cold, she actually comes to life. And so often this is seen as, a tale of misogyny and a man wanting this mute, subservient wife. I think it is that, but I think it's also a cautionary tale for model makers. So, yeah. So there's an interesting book. So this slide has one book and two people on it. Person on the left is Milton Friedman. Person on the right is a guy called George Stigler, who is wearing a t-shirt saying Adam Smith's best friend. And in the middle is a really interesting book that came out in the last few years called Adam Smith's America by Glory Liu. And it basically shows how a Scottish moral philosopher was transformed into the father of capitalism in America. And among other things, she argues that Friedman and Stigler, who were prime movers of the Chicago school, sort of ripped ideas like the invisible hand completely out of their context and used them as sort of poetic metaphors for their own idea of a world ordered by prices. This has caused many problems. I would argue this slide has way too much writing on it, but I would argue that actually Adam Smith, it's really fascinating going back and reading Adam Smith in the original, because he was a massive critic of the largest corporation of the day, which was the East India Company. And he often thought that, merchants and manufacturers, what did he say? Merchants have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and who accordingly have upon many occasions both deceived and oppressed it. And I think that there is a story to be told of Adam Smith as a critic of corporate and merchant power, and that is not something that David Ricardo followed. So, as I say, there is towards the end of the book, I take it up to the current day and try to show some of the problems that have come up through the use of this very abstract methodology for economics. So I talk about finance and how economic models boosted the wealth and power of modern finance and blinded many to its fragility. I talk about there was a free trade dogma that diverted attention from the expansion of corporate rights and eventually shocked democracy. So essentially how the sort of, the idea of free trade was often used to justify a situation in which corporations were able to increase their rights and power through treaties that often they had much more impact on than elected officials. And then I have a chapter called Life and Externality, how climate economics help mislead elite opinion on the issue of our time. So I'll spend a little bit more time on that, and then I'll finish and be interested in your comments and questions. Hopefully I've not confused you too much. So this chapter largely focuses on a critique of William Nordhaus, and also a larger critique of the idea of externalities. This is an idea that came from an economist called Pigou in the 1920s. And essentially, it's the idea that if you have a transaction and there's a third party that is not involved in the transaction, but is either hurt or harmed by it, that is what's called a positive or a negative externality. So the climate is a perfect example. You place an order, at a large factory, and you get the order, but actually the factory spews a lot of pollutants out into the air, and there are, other people who are influenced by that were not involved in it. So the economic ideal has been to put a price on carbon. So whether that's through cap and trade schemes or whether that's through a carbon tax. And so there's been lots and lots of discussion of what the social cost of carbon is, what the right cost of carbon is. And I argue that the entire idea of externalities has been much better at saving mainstream theory than it has actually been at saving the ecosystem in which we live. And so William Nordhaus was granted the Nobel Prize in 2018 for his work on climate change, and sparked some controversy during his Nobel speech, saying that the optimal level of warming, I believe he said it was up to 3 degrees to the end of the century and 4 degrees in 150 years' time. And he's done this by apparently scientifically balancing the economic impacts and the environmental impacts. But if you actually dig into how those numbers are created, it's rather shocking, actually. One, how poorly they essentially how it's a little bit like that Blake image that I showed you. It focuses on a very small area and is blind to larger areas. And Nordhaus has kind of since the 90s. I mean, he believes in climate change. He thinks it's important. He's constantly saying that there should be a higher carbon tax, but he's often said things that have made people think that climate change is not such a big deal, and that it might knock 0.25% or 0.5% off GDP, but actually those numbers are created in a way that I think gives them absolutely no credibility. I can say a little bit more about that later if you want. And that is being increasingly recognized. And I guess how I'd say I think it fits into a broader context is so much of economics has prided itself on crisp, precise answers, but the way they have reached those crisp, precise answers is to fundamentally change the question they're looking at. They've substituted. They're answering questions about a world that doesn't exist, about a theoretical world, and the crisp, precise answers are highly, they look good. They can be defended as the best of science, but actually, they're often wildly inaccurate. So I say we've been led by financial models with no crashes in them, by trade models with no state power, by climate models with very little climate, and by anti-monopoly models with no corporate power. So in so many different ways, this sort of mainstream vision has made very important things disappear. So that's the book. Hopefully that was enough, but not too much. These are my contact details. I've got some more stuff on the website, including some videos and sort of podcasts and sort of links to other articles and things. So yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for your attention, and I'd love to get your thoughts, comments, questions. I think Ian said he wanted to do the using the hands up symbol. Is that right? I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Nat. That was brilliant. Are we back to full screen? We've got a raised hand from Richard.
Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting and very provocative. I think that I come from a physics background, and I noticed Trevor posted something along the lines of physics envy when it comes to economics. But of course, linear thinking is great, when you're solving relatively simple physics problems. But anybody involved in things like fluid mechanics realize that the really interesting stuff is in the non-linear modeling of the world, and how wickedly, horribly complicated but fascinating it all is. I mean, I have friends who work in the world of computational fluid dynamics, and the Navier-Stokes equation was the thing that kind of winds everybody up into a froth and a lava trying to solve it and make aeroplanes fly better and all the rest of it. And that's the issue. It's the linearization. I mean, really, physics is not linear. Anybody involved in physics knows that the real problems are the non-linear ones, and also the indeterminate ones. You know, the sort of stuff buried in quantum mechanics and complex interactions of complex many interactions. And I think that's the other point. It's not just a simple linear transaction between an atom and an atom or whatever. Not only is it quantum mechanical, but it's all happening everywhere at once. And it's that kind of realization that makes physicists wonder what the hell economists were thinking about when they thought they could do everything by linear thinking. Because it's absolutely and essentially a network thing that's going on, of which we just abstract a little bit of reality just to clear our heads a little bit. But we know if we're going to do anything useful, we've got to actually model the whole picture, which then raises the interesting question, what the whole picture is in terms of the framing of the system and making the visibility of the causality, of the causal connections, at least to begin with qualitatively, but hopefully more and more quantitative stuff. But then you look at atmospheric physics and all of a sudden you realize it's all highly nonlinear, butterfly effect and all the rest of it. So I mean, that's just something from the physics corner that says, you know, linear thinking don't work.
Thank you, Richard. Jeff, I think we'll take a few and then I can come back. Jeff.
Yes. Yes, I've read the book, Nat, and I was absolutely fascinated. I think it's a great read. And
thank you.
I'm not an economist. I'm just a layperson who's been interested in economics and reads blogs and listens to podcasts about it. And I understand that you were critiquing classical economics largely from your own background in development work, I think. And I appreciate that. And of course, you can't cover all the ways in which classical economics can be critiqued. But I did think there was one omission that was a bit ashamed to miss out, which was that classical economics doesn't recognize money, that money is transparent to it. And the idea that money arose naturally from barter, which is still in the textbooks, for which there is no historical evidence. Money is a creation of the state for the public purpose. And classical economics just doesn't recognize how money is created, where it comes from. In other words, there's no theory of money, which is quite extraordinary, really, when you think about it. And so also what I'm looking forward to is you writing volume 2, part 2, in which you're going to compare and contrast all the different other schools of economic thought that there are and come to the conclusion that modern monetary theory is the answer to the world, the universe and everything. And I'd also like to ask if you've read Bill Mitchell's book, Reclaiming the State, because I think that deals with a lot of the things that you've been wrestling with as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Should do one more and then I'll come back and then we can do another round. Or if there's nothing right now, I can answer those two. Great.
I'm going to come in because I can't find. We keep using Teams, and Zoom is quite an unfamiliar space for me. Try to find how to raise my hand.
Oh, no, go. They're perfect.
So, yeah, I didn't read all the book, to be honest. My husband took it from me, and he thought it's quite interesting. So he didn't let me to finish it. And from the perspective of, yes, externality. everything you said is correct. But again, this monetary and this need to report everything in monetary term creates the school that trains people like me, that we are environmental economists, we put monetary value on everything. Because the basis of decision making is money. You give cost benefit analysis. And however, the basis of decision making is money. We see that a lot of people in the place of decision making, even they don't care about the bigger picture. The example, externality, the third runaway of Heathrow. It's good for business, bad for environment. Which one you choose? Either Rachel Reeves should go home and retire and we have a new chancellor, or she loves the power. She's going to stick to it and she's going to say, I'm going to go with growth, but environment, I'm going to sacrifice it. So these are all these things that, as our friend said, these are all non-linear and requires, again, putting monetary value on everything. And I always say that if I do evaluation for externality, for environment, non-market goods and services, because yes, they need a precise number from very, very rough methodology. Because I always say, if I do evaluation today and tomorrow, 2 days, separate days, and I just write down my results on 2 different days, I'm going to have very, very different numbers. I've been in this business for many years now. And I know it, that if I do it today with the same group of people today, depends on how I'm going to ask the question from them, what is my mood, and so on. If I offer them something to answer the question or not, I sometimes might get 70% margin of error. And we don't know how to solve this sort of problems. Because, yes, we need to come up with the money price for everything.
Right.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm delighted with the idea of you and your husband tussling over the book. That's great. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. Great questions. This is a really good start. So yeah, linear thinking and non-linear. Don't have a physics background, but yes, I think you're completely right, Richard, in that a lot of I've heard a lot of people say that actually the sort of physics envy is an envy of a physics that is hundreds of years old. But yeah, I think I think what you say is exactly right, and I try and pull out a few quotes in the book of people who've said similar things, and some of them, I think actually John Maynard Keynes for me sort of summed it up better than others. And one quote that I was really stunned when I read it first. Well, I'll share two with you. One is he described the classical economists as being Euclidean geometers in a non-Euclidean world, and that's lots of jargon, but basically like Euclid, the father of geometry, but operating in a world that's not actually Euclidean. And there's this sort of there's this tension, but they can't get out of this mindset. And then potentially slightly ruining the end of the book, but I come back to Newton at the end, and I really like this quote from Keynes, and it was from the 1930s. He's writing to a friend, and he says, so this is my introduction, saying people could only be like Newton's apple falling from the tree. So, because if, and then this is Keynes's quote, the fall of the apple to the ground depended on the apple's motives, on whether it's worthwhile falling to the ground, whether the ground wanted the apple to fall, and on mistaken calculations on the part of the apple as to how far it was from the center of the earth. For me, I think that's wonderful sort of satire, because obviously that's not happening with the apple, but obviously it's happening with humans, and we just need to sort of break that analogy. So yes, I agreed with what you said. Jeff, yeah, really interesting. Please, thanks for reading the book. Pleased you really liked it. As you said, I couldn't get everything in there, and part of what I was trying to do was to sort of tell a clean story and to write for people like you and others who don't do this it's not who are not academic economists, to try and sort of interest them. Yes, I'm sure you're absolutely right. I could have said much more about money. I was wondering, with the story of sort of money and barter, was that something is that something sort of like David Graeber's first 5,000 years of debt and all of that? Yeah.
And other historians of of money.
Yes.
Hudson is another guy who's written about
Yeah.
Mesopotamia. He talks about a lot.
Yes. No, interesting. It's something I need to learn more about, but I completely, inventing historical fairy tales is, I would say, one of the bread and butter principles of a lot of mainstream economics. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it does definitely fit the
Perhaps
format.
I could just say, for the benefit of the others who've not come across MMT, modern money theory, before, that MMT's theory of money says that money is a creation of the state because it was invented by rulers in order to provision the state, to get people to work for the ruler in order to create army, to build pyramids, and so on. But it was not originated from markets. Markets came after, and they used the currency or money that had already been created by rulers to get people to work for them.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a story of public provision, in other words.
I haven't. I'll check out the Bill Mitchell Reclaiming the State book. Your idea of volume 2 sounds a much more challenging book to write, to be honest. And in some ways, what I was trying to do is, obviously there's many books that criticize classical economics, but I was trying to sort of help to, neoclassical and classical economics. I was trying to sort of clear the way for, many other ideas to bloom. I'm less of a fan of MMT, I must admit. So, I haven't read much of it in the original, but I'm much more so one sort of my guiding star is, as I mentioned at the top, someone called Susan Strange, and I think she would argue that that might work for a hegemon, a state like the United States that is in the center of the financial system and has what's sometimes called, the extraordinary privilege. But for smaller countries, then I'm not sure. I don't think that the state itself could withstand, printing endless amounts of money. You might come back and tell me that's not what MMT is about, but yeah, that's my initial thought on that. And yeah, Sarah, sorry, Jeff, I'll let you come back. Yeah, no, yeah, I think it's really interesting what you say. Essentially, we are stuck within a system that tries to use money as the value on which everything should be judged. So we have a system in which, certainly in the US and probably in the UK, although I'm slightly less, I haven't read up so much about that. There is an official sort of value of life. A life is worth, 4 million, 12 million. It changes
UK
from time.
as well. UK as well.
UK as well. And essentially, yes, cost benefit analysis is seen as this sort of impartial tool in order to get to the best and most efficient way. I would argue that essentially that is always prioritizing wealth, and I would argue that wealth is only one value within society, and there are other values like justice, like security. I think people are waking up to this more through, for example, problems with COVID supply chains, through, for example, national security concerns, whether that's with China, whether that's with Russia, that actually sometimes it's worth taking a hit on your wealth if that means you continue to be a functioning independent country. And essentially I see that the sort of the narrow focus on just on seeing everything in terms of money is part of the problem that I'm critiquing. I realize that would be a huge shift to move out of that. I kind of see, and this, the idea of going for growth. I think it's very, it's just a word that contains. yeah, I don't think essentially it's another substitution. Growth is seen as high standards of living, but actually, does it really contribute? Does it really equate to high standards of living all the time and for everyone? No. Um, Jeff, I'm going to let you come back briefly on MMT, and then I see Guy Dorsey has a comment, and then I'll leave it open to others.
Well, I just point out that MMT academics could, of course, refute all the criticisms you made about MMT, particularly on inflation. They talk about nothing but inflation and how it should be controlled. But Nat, so of the other schools of thought of economics, Keynesian, post-Keynesian, and so on. I mean, I presume you're in the post-Keynesian area. I mean, how would you describe your particular school you favour? Which one is it?
Well, I would say it's I'm not much of a joiner, I must say. So, but I would say that one of my main inspirations has been Susan Strange. That's international political economy. And so she had a structural view on the global political economy. And that essentially she divided she wanted to look at the military structure, the production structure, the finance structure, and the knowledge structure. And so it's a very broad view. Out of the ones that you
institutionalism, is this institutionalism?
I mean, it's related. Yeah, it is aware of institutions, and it's aware of history. Having done the book, I'm a big fan of what Keynes originally said, and I'm also a big fan and I'm also very much agreed with the idea that Keynesianism, as it came to be known, had very little to do with Keynes. I quote Samuelson calling himself a cafeteria Keynesianism. He said he took the bits he liked and left the bits he didn't, which I think is quite an apt quote. But Guy, and then and then I'll open it up to others.
Thanks. So I would say that you're a well-being economist if I was to sort of put you in a box. There's a whole field of well-being economics that is trying to put all these pieces together. On the climate thing briefly, the astonishing thing is that Richard Nordhaus's work was referenced as part of the IPCC's scientific analysis, as if Nordhaus was a scientist. And his papers were never reviewed by other climate scientists. They were only reviewed by economists following the neoclassical nostrums. And what's astonishing to me is that, I mean, I've been working in the climate field for 30 years, is that nobody thought to critique his work until Stephen Keen started looking at this around 2018, which is, almost 30 years after the IPCC process started, which tells me that very few people are schooled in the failings of economics and of neoclassical economics. Very few people understand the weaknesses of the way economics does and the sort of the false modeling and stuff like that. So, and it is really appalling. I mean, Stephen Keen has done a total takedown, and he should be stripped of Nordhaus should be stripped of his Nobel Prize if there was such an ability to do that, right? On the other thing I loved about your book was the storytelling. I mean, because you really dive into the history of Portugal and Britain and Brazil and slavery and stuff like that. And one of the deliberate weaknesses of economic theory is the choice to ignore power. We're not going to talk about power because you can't analyze power mathematically. And the power relations, whether between a tenant and a landlord or an owner and the worker, or a sort of British Navy and a tiny Portuguese fleet of whatever, it's ignored all the way through. And so it's a huge flaw within economics. And you reveal that, you pull back the power relationship between Portugal and England. And, it's almost like, Monty Python would have fun with the way you do that sort of stuff. I can see a skit on the whole thing. And the other fascinating thing is that your critique of Ricardo was common by other economists, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so it was dismissed as being nonsense economics for a long time until it was revived by the neoliberals because it has such a unique ability to put selfishness at the center of everything and have a pseudo-intellectual justification for maximizing capital gain and maximizing rip-offs in trade and stuff like that, and by ignoring the power thing. So I love that, your historical analysis. I mean, you say you're not an economist. Well, I know that the training of that, but for doing my book, I've had to read 500 books on economics and economic history. Your book is right up there in the quality of your research and analysis and understanding. You know, you don't ever be a whatever. You're
Thank
right
you,
up
Guy.
there with the
Appreciate
best.
that.
Right up there with the best. And finally on MMT, my test of any one single theory is like, if Trump was to run with MMT, how would it go? Really badly. If Trump could use the Federal Reserve to create money for his needs, even if he pretended it wasn't going to cause inflation, it would go really badly. So MMT is not a silver bullet. It's simply a realization that central banks create money, and in any economy that has spare capacity, that money can be used to solve climate problems, to build affordable housing, as long as it doesn't cause inflation. It only causes inflation when there's no capacity within the economy to absorb that money. But that understanding that central banks do create money as well as private banks is something that, you know, hardly anyone really acknowledges. Central banks created money to bail out the banks in the 2008 financial crisis and again in the COVID crisis. Globally, $41 trillion has been added by central bank created money, and it's all ended up in the hands of the super mega wealthy, the billionaires. That's the skewiness of the whole thing. Anyway, I'll shut up. It's a fabulous book. Thanks.
I really appreciate that, Guy. Thank you. Yeah, any more comments, especially from people we haven't heard? Could be completely left field comments, could be questions. There's no silly questions. Yeah, open up to anyone.
Can I ask, Donald Trump may have read your book because you're saying, you know, globalism is over. We're going to put tariffs on everything to protect American industry. So how do you feel about that? Comment?
Yeah, no, I think that's I do think that's a very interesting point, Jeff. And what I say in the book is that, what do I say? I say Donald Trump told, 30,000 lies in office the first time, but he also pushed conventional wisdom to accept one big truth, which is that trade can, wreck lives as well as improve lives. And I think the fact that there was this free trade dogma for the 30 years before Trump gave him power to impose his own solutions, which were actually very short-sighted transactional solutions. And I think Donald Trump too is going even further down that route of using tariffs as this sort of bludgeon and as this weapon. And I think tariffs are a little bit like taxes or regulation. It's quite fashionable among sort of mainstream anti-Trump liberals to be like, all tariffs are wrong. But I think just like taxes and regulations, I think there's good ways to use them and bad ways to use them. So no, I do think that's an interesting challenge. I think what I would say though is that we can't. I think the people around Trump are right that the Ricardian world is dead and that we shouldn't go back to the Ricardian world. But the type of economic system that I, promote in the book is obviously very different to the one that is the one that is being charted by the Trump White House. I see Alison and there was one and Hugh. So Alison, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I just the whole thing is really, really good. And having something in English is so important because people they don't get it quite how unfair everything is. Yeah, I've got ADHD and I did work out a lot of things. Hence, I'm an environmentalist and was so back almost when I was a child, listening to what we were taught at school, because we were taught things at school and saying, but that can't work without somebody getting hurt. And I would say this to my mum and she said, darling, I think probably somebody's probably thought about that. Like, just shut up. I don't know what you're talking about. And it was really true. And it was usually the environment and poor people that got hurt. And I come from Hull as well. So we used to go every year to the William Wilberforce Museum and learn about slavery to a very large degree. And that was really in my head. Not, of course, that it was him that abolished slavery, but we do like the single white man theory of heroism, don't we? So I can't remember what I was going to say, really. Sorry, ADHD brain. Yeah, I think that's it. The main thing is that it's in English. Because another thing, when I learned about pensions, I went to as a cooperative bank. So I thought, okay, they're going to be ethical. This is many, many, many years ago now. And so he explained how it works. And I said, so you want me to bet my pension on the stock exchange? What are you talking about? And he said, I said, is that really how pensions work? And he said, well, we don't call it betting. And I said, no, but it is. Do you know what I mean? And so a lot of the words are taken out. Even in war, they go to a theatre, don't they? And this has a massive impact on people. So I work a lot in conflict resolution, not in war kind of conflict resolution, but you know, where people have passions and want to build a landfill or whatever, and we get the whole system in the room and come up with the best thing to do. And these words, they really matter. So getting good words out there that real people can use that really get to what it is absolutely vital. Because without those real words, I can't say the real words as a facilitator because nobody will understand them. And so you just use all this old stuff, which is based on, as you said, fantasy. So yeah, and so most of my work, we work it out, and it is not based on, it is based on science because we have amazing scientists that come in, and it's heart. And often the scientists there they say, oh, but it, you know, we don't want it to be, or the MPs, in fact, they say we don't want to be just driven by feelings, you know. And I think, well, goodness me, what are you going to be driven by? Because these feelings will have an impact on your bottom line because they're going to act based on their feelings. You need to know what they are. So that's, I spend a lot of time helping people with that kind of stuff. And so real words, fantastic. So
Thank you, Alison.
and I need to go and get my son now. So yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll just come back on that quickly then. So yeah, one of my what I was trying to do is trying to explain things in a relatively simple way, and as Guy said, you know, using stories, and yeah, trying to unpick some of these words like rational or efficient, because I don't actually think that the technical, what they technically mean, is not related to their everyday use in the language, and I think that causes a huge amount of problem. And then yeah, when you talk about betting your pension, I was talking about Susan Strange earlier. One of her famous books is called Casino Capitalism, and she sort of back in the 80s she pushed this idea that you know, the Western financial system is becoming like a casino, and I think that's been obscured by the ideas of saying no, it's just, you know, efficient markets and la la la. So yes, so I agree. I agree with that. And yeah, coming back to Guy on his first point. Yeah, I'm pleased you so completely agree about you know, Steve Keen doing a great job on Nordhaus, and that's how I first, I think, came on this, but then sort of, you know, dug around it and was genuinely quite shocked by what I saw and how some of those numbers were created. I think some of that idea of why the climate scientists weren't looking at the economists is generally just, you know, the specialization that we have in society, which hopefully works, right? You know, you can't know everything. We live in, and so, you know, when you go and see an eye doctor, you want someone who's, you know, studied that for many years, and so it should be the same for economics. But I would argue that profession has let us down. And I'm really pleased you picked up on the idea that, yeah, Ricardo's economics essentially died, and I wanted to include that because basically to give us a bit of hope now that even when it seems, you know, completely hegemonic and like it won't change, it has changed before, and so it can again. Right, I want to get Hugh in before we have to finish in about 5 minutes, and then if there's one other person, I see Guy's got his hand up but has spoken already, so if there's someone else who hasn't spoken and wants to come in, then but Hugh first, and then maybe room just for one more.
Thanks very much, Nat. Just a quick point. Reference was made to the 2008 financial crisis, and I remember at the time all these complicated financial instruments coming out of the subprime mortgage market, and the rating agencies at the time, Fitch, Standard and Poor, and I forgot the third one, all gave these instruments triple star rating, and yet 4 weeks later they all became junk bond status, and yet governments and economists and people are still listening to these rating agencies today. How are such traditional institutions in economics able to hold such sway in the face of a catastrophic failure on their part?
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. Is there I'm happy for Guy to come in, but if someone else who hasn't spoken has a sort of, point. Anyone?
I'll just have a last word after Guy.
Yeah, okay. So Guy, why don't you come in?
I'll be very brief. It's just that when on the realm of tariffs, the French economist Gabriel Zucman and the German economist Christian Felber are both arguing for tariffs based on adoption of labor standards, environmental standards, and stuff like that. So you'd have tariffs against the countries that have very low labor standards or very low environmental standards, and you'd raise the standard of those global agreements through the tariffs. So it's turning it all around. Gabriel Zucman, who's one of the best known tax economists, he calls it interpositional protectionism, in which importing nations would apply their own laws beyond their borders to tax large undertaxed companies through the trade stuff. So it's worth looking into their work. Yeah, thanks.
Right.
Thank you, Ian. Do you want to have the last word, or shall I just come back on that?
You come back on that, please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So no, Hugh, I think that's a great point about the ratings agencies. I couldn't agree more. I would say positively that although some of those institutions are still there and some of the systems haven't changed, I think it has kickstarted, a massive questioning of both the economic system and the ideology behind it. And so, so there are some positives that have come out of the mess of the global financial crisis. But yes, I think that is almost like the prime example of, the disconnect between the sort of, theory and actually the reality. That's really interesting what you were saying about Gabriel Zucman. I think he's really, he's a very interesting economist. I followed some of his work on inequality and had this great book, The Hidden Wealth of Nations, looking at sort of offshore money. But I'd seen that, but I haven't read into it. So I think I will read into it more now. That does sound very interesting. But yeah, thank you everyone for really engaging discussion. I enjoyed it. I hope you did too. You do have my email from earlier. It's nat.dyer.author@gmail.com if you want to email me about anything. And
right, Nat Dyer.
It's Nat, so that's Nat.Dyer, Dyer, .author, spelt like you would normally, @gmail.com, just because all the normal Nat Dyers were not working. So
I want to press you a bit more on tariffs, so we'll do it by email.
Sure.
Right.
Over to Ian.
Well, I'd like to say a big thank you to Nat. My thoughts were, I was listening to all the names of economists that were mentioned this afternoon. We didn't actually mention Schumacher.
Karl Marx.
Well, maybe, yes, quite a few others missing there as well. I'd just like to throw in one sort of comment from Schumacher, was that traditional economics seems to be about maximizing consumption all the time, whereas Buddhist economics viewpoint is about optimizing sufficiency. And I think that sort of big paradigm shifting is what's needed so much in the world at the moment. And in terms of that, also the paradigm shifting between the sort of the physics approach and the complexity sciences, I think is really important, that we sort of learn that sort of economic activity is very much like the weather. And I think, Richard, you mentioned that this sort of chaotic nature of a weather patterns, where really at the end of the day, if we do shift into that mode of thinking, are we left with only having to cope with what comes towards us rather than direct what things are? So there's some interesting thoughts that have come out of this. I think we could I think we could probably go on all night with this discussion if you wanted to, Nat. But I would just like to sum up and say on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much indeed for this session, and thank you very much for writing the book. And yeah, when's the next one coming?
I'm slightly have book PTSD from I'm really looking forward to writing lots of shorter things rather than trying to put it all together in a book. But yeah, it's great to know that you'd be interested. So
It was a phenomenal achievement, and yeah, thank you for that, and for this session today. So
thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciated it.
great to see you.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Nat.
Cheers, everybody.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Nat. Thank
Till
you,
the next
Ian.
time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers. Right. Thanks, Nat. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Yeah.
And thanks for agreeing to take a look at my manuscript there, Nat.
Yes, no. You're very welcome. I was thinking I had lots of people. I sent similar emails to lots of people, sort of being like, I don't know you very well, but would you mind looking at stuff? And it was. I certainly got. Obviously, you get ignored sometimes, but I got a lot of people who said yes, and so very happy to pay it forward.
And I just sent you an email with the references to those two trade, Christian Felber and the Zupplin, the link and stuff like that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. No, I'd seen that he'd written an op-ed in Le Monde, but I haven't seen anything in English. So I'll you've just sent those to me, have you?
It's by email. Yeah, it comes across.
Great.
So
okay.
Thank
you, Guy. Yeah, and thanks for all your kind words. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Yeah, Ian, I thought that went really well.
Yes, excellent, really good. It's nice to have that sort of size group in a way, isn't it? Because
yes,
yeah, not too few, but sometimes you get a lot more people. It gets very tricky to get to allow people to say what they want to say. So
I was a little worried in the beginning that it was going too slow, but I think letting everyone, letting everyone sort of have a little voice was good.
I think it's excellent. Yes, indeed.
Do you know the Jeff guy? Jeff at redted.org?
No,
okay.
no, that's a new one to me. I'm going to follow
okay.
up and see where he is because it's quite a deep thinker. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No, but really enjoyed it. It was encouraging that some of the people had got the book and stuff. So great.
Good stuff.
Well, I'm sure we'll be in touch. And we emailed a while ago about me coming to the office in Bristol at some point, and I said that I would let you know by email, and we'd work out a date because you said you might come in on that day or whatever if we can, or if you're there already.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, whenever, and yeah, if you want to use the desk and space in Create whenever you want, do so.
Thank you.
We can alert the reception desk, and they might make you an entry card so you can.
Okay.
Nobody ever asks for them, but
okay. Great.
Yeah, very laid back place.
And is this I see you're doing the £5 charging thing. Is this something you've started for a while, or was I the guinea pig? Or
you were the guinea pig, I'm afraid. We it's sort of our management team is very unstructured, and the decision was made without asking me actually.
Oh, okay.
So I sort of let it go. I thought, well, let's experiment and see what actually happens. I'm not convinced myself that we need to charge, but maybe. Make sure people come though if they.
Yes, no, there is that. Great. Okay.
Lovely. Okay.
Cheers, Ian.
See you soon. Take care.
Appreciate that. Bye.
Bye.